The sun had only just begun to crest the hills outside Eldridge, Montana, when Marvin DuBois swung open the screen door to his porch. The hinges let out a soft groan, a sound he'd grown fond of over the years. It reminded him of old boxcars easing into place, that familiar rhythm of things worn but reliable. The morning air was cool, still holding on to the last breath of night, and the scent of wet earth lingered in the breeze. Marvin adjusted the collar of his flannel shirt and stepped onto the gravel path leading to the road. His boots crunched softly beneath him, the sound swallowed by the quiet of a town not yet awake. He walked slowly but with purpose, his wooden cane tapping in rhythm to each careful step. At 78, Marvin had outlived his wife, his daughter, and most of the men he used to work with down at the rail yard. Now it was just him and little Jo, his 9-year-old granddaughter, still sleeping back in the house with her head tucked under the quilt her mother had made. Wednesday was barbershop day. It had always been long before the town shrank before the mill shut down and before the bakery on Main turned into a vape store. Marvin kept the tradition not out of vanity, but because some things shouldn't be let go no matter how small they seemed. As he moved past the rusted mailbox and onto the paved shoulder of County Route 14, the sky overhead shifted into soft gold. A pickup passed him slowly and respectfully, its driver lifting 2 fingers off the wheel in greeting. Marvin nodded back. That was just how things were done in Eldridge. People still waved even when they didn't remember your name. The town itself was no more than 5 blocks wide and 2 long. There was the feed store, a gas station, the church with the white steeple that peeled in the summer, and of course Ray's barbershop. Marvin had been going to Ray's since '62, back when the chairs had real leather and the floors smelled like bay rum and talcum powder. He passed by the post office, noting the flag had already been raised. That meant Arlene was in early. She always was on Wednesdays. Marvin liked the way people here had their own rhythms, like the slow chug of an engine at idle. Nobody hurried in Eldridge, not unless they had to. At the corner, he paused to rest against the rail outside the hardware store. His knees ached more this season than last, but pain didn't bother him much. He'd been carrying it since his wife Madeline passed 5 winters ago. That kind of weight never left. You just got better at shifting it around. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small tin. Inside were 2 peppermint lozenges, one for the walk there, one for the walk back. He placed one on his tongue and let it rest. Sweet, sharp, familiar. The barbershop came into view just as the church bells rang once. Ray's windows were still dark, but Marvin could see the barber's old Dodge parked out back. That meant he'd be opening soon. Marvin liked being early. It gave him time to sit, rest, and think. He reached the bench out front and lowered himself carefully, one hand steady on the armrest. The wood creaked beneath him. Across the street, the diner's neon flickered to life. The town was beginning to stretch its arms. Marvin glanced at the sign in the window. Same hand-painted letters, faded but proud. Ray's Barbershop, Est 1954. He remembered the first time he brought his daughter here for a trim before school started. She climbed into the big chair, all knees and nerves, and Ray had let her hold the comb while he worked. He smiled at the memory, then closed his eyes for a moment. The wind nudged his coat gently. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked twice and was answered by another. It was the kind of morning you could fold up and keep in your shirt pocket. His cane leaned against his leg. His hands rested atop each other, weathered and strong. These hands had pulled levers, repaired box switches, held his wife's fingers as she passed, and cradled his granddaughter after nightmares. They weren't soft, but they had never once let go when it mattered. Marvin opened his eyes again and looked down the street. No rush. Ray would open when he was ready. The world could take its time, and Marvin would be there right where he always was on a Wednesday morning, waiting. Not because he had to, because it was right. And some things, no matter how much the world changed, were still worth showing up for. Ray's barbershop opened right on time, same as always. The bell above the door gave its familiar jingle as Marvin stepped in the scent of talc and old pine floor wax wrapping around him like an old sweater. Ray gave a small nod from behind the chair, already brushing off his clippers, his hands slow but steady. Marvin took his usual seat by the window, resting his cane across his knees. The radio played low in the corner, crackling out a country tune too old for even Ray to hum along with. Outside, the sun had warmed the sidewalk, and Main Street was coming to life. For a few minutes, everything felt like it used to. Then the boys came in. The door flew open too fast, and the bell clanged hard against the glass. Jack strolled in first, all swagger and sunglasses like he thought someone was watching. Behind him came Remy Hoodie, pulled up phone in hand, already filming. Luca trailed behind, quiet, scanning the room with a sort of amused detachment. Ray blinked twice, clearly caught off guard. He offered a polite welcome, his voice thin. The boys didn't answer. Jax made a show of stretching, then dropped into the chair nearest Marvin, legs spread wide, tapping his boots together like he owned the floor. Remy snorted at the decor, pointing his phone at the old black and white photos lining the wall. Small-town barbershop, he mumbled to the camera. Real vintage horror movie vibes. Jax laughed. Man, this place smells like my granddad's sock drawer. Ray smiled weakly. Marvin didn't move. Remy zoomed in on the cash register, then turned the camera toward Marvin, whispering something to Luca that made him chuckle. Marvin kept his gaze on the window. He'd seen boys like them before, loud on the outside, hollow underneath. Luca leaned back in the creaky wooden bench and cracked his knuckles. Does anyone still cut hair here? Or is this just a museum? Ray cleared his throat and said something about walk-ins being welcome, but his words didn't carry far. The boys weren't listening. Jack spotted the candy jar near the counter and popped 2 peppermints into his mouth without asking. He tossed one toward Marvin's feet, grinning when it bounced off the man's boot. Sorry, Pops, your reflexes are too slow. Marvin glanced down, then looked away. He didn't pick it up. The silence in the room shifted. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was tight, like someone had turned down the air. Remy laughed too loudly, then stopped to replay a clip on his phone. Jax leaned in to see it. They cackled. The volume was up. Their voices filled the little shop, bouncing off the framed mirrors and old photographs like insults that didn't belong. Ray busied himself wiping down the counter again, wiping things that didn't need wiping. He opened the drawer, closed it, and opened it again. His hands trembled just enough for Marvin to notice. The boys weren't drunk. They weren't on anything. But they were young and unbothered by consequence, which was sometimes worse. They didn't see Marvin as a man. They saw him as a prop, something quaint, something easy to disrespect. Marvin shifted slightly in his chair. Not much, just enough to plant his feet. Jax caught the movement and smirked. You want to cut too, old-timer? Bet you used to get fades with a chisel and hammer. Remy laughed again. Luca didn't. He was looking at Marvin now with something like curiosity, like he wasn't sure what to make of him. Ray tried again to steer the moment back. Sir, you were here first. You ready? Marvin nodded once, but didn't rise. His gaze drifted toward the door. Something had changed. Outside, through the dusty glass, came the low, steady sound of a motorcycle engine. Not the whine of a sport bike, not the roar of a custom hog, just a quiet, gravelly growl that settled in your bones and made you sit up straighter. The boys didn't hear it at first. They were still scrolling, still smirking. But Ray looked up. Marvin's eyes narrowed, not in worry, but in recognition, or maybe hope. The engine cut off outside the shop. No knock, no door yet. Just silence and the faint sound of cooling metal ticking against morning air. Inside, something stilled. Jax shifted in his seat. Luca turned his head toward the glass. Remy finally pulled down his hoodie. Then the bell above the door jingled once more. The bell over the door gave a soft jingle, but somehow it felt heavier this time. Chuck Norris stepped through the doorway like he wasn't entering a place so much as assessing it. He took one slow look around the room, his eyes moving from Ray to the boys, then settling briefly on Marvin. His expression didn't shift. It didn't need to. He wore a denim shirt, sleeves rolled neatly to the forearms, and the dust on his jeans looked earned, not decorative. He removed his sunglasses, slowly folding them with care before slipping them into the front pocket. Every movement was quiet and controlled, as if noise was a luxury he rarely used. Ray straightened without realizing it. His hand paused mid-wipe along the counter. Chuck gave a single nod in Ray's direction. Nothing more. Remy muttered something under his breath about cowboys and walked backward a few steps to get a wider angle with his phone. He aimed it discreetly at Chuck, then flicked his eyes to Jax. Jax smirked and leaned closer to Marvin. Still waiting, old-timer bet. This guy wants his beard oiled and braided too. Marvin didn't flinch. He kept his gaze forward. The peppermint lay at his feet untouched. Chuck moved toward the bench by the wall, but his eyes paused a second longer on Jax. He took a seat near the coat rack, hands resting on his thighs, his posture straight but relaxed. He didn't say a word. The energy in the room shifted without anyone fully knowing why. It was like the air had thickened or maybe just steadied itself. Ray fumbled with his clippers, plugged them in, then unplugged them again. Jax clicked his tongue and turned toward Chuck. You from around here? Or you just drift in wherever the wind smells like mothballs? Chuck said nothing. His eyes flicked once to Jax, then returned to the worn spot on the floor in front of him. Jax snorted and pulled out his phone. He opened the camera and began recording Marvin. He zoomed in slowly, whispering a sarcastic commentary. Look at this majestic relic. Ancient Marvin King of the Sit-Still tribe. Remy chuckled. Luca looked uneasy but didn't speak. Chuck exhaled slowly, then spoke. 3 words. Put that away. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move. But something in the tone made Remy freeze mid-laugh. Even Jax blinked like he hadn't heard it right. What was that? Chuck didn't repeat himself. He simply looked at Jax. Not a glare, not a threat. It just had a steady look, like a man deciding if something was worth standing up for. Ray set the clippers down again. The radio was still playing, but nobody heard it anymore. Jack stood straighter, suddenly aware of how close he was to Marvin. He flicked his phone screen off slowly, almost like it was his idea. Chuck leaned back slightly, never breaking eye contact. That's better. Luca glanced from Chuck to Jax and then to Remy. Nobody said anything. Marvin shifted his cane slightly, not to use it, just to feel its weight. Jax licked his bottom lip, then looked over at Ray. You gonna cut his hair or what? Or are we just playing funeral today? Ray opened his mouth, then closed it. Chuck spoke again, softer this time. You should stop talking. This time there was no sarcasm in Jax's eyes. Just confusion, maybe even a flicker of something else. Something like doubt. Chuck didn't rise. He didn't posture. But the quiet around him was loud enough to change the temperature in the room. Remy lowered his phone. Luca crossed his arms and leaned against the wall, silent now. Marvin finally looked over at Chuck. No smile, no nod, just acknowledgement, like two men who'd seen the same kind of long days and knew the value of silence. Outside, a gust of wind pushed a leaf up against the shop window. It stuck there for a moment, then dropped out of sight. Inside, nobody moved. Not the boys, not Ray, not even Chuck. The balance of the room had shifted, but no one could quite explain how. All they knew was that someone had entered their game and rewritten the rules without saying more than a sentence. Jax didn't like the silence. He wasn't used to it. Not the kind that settled in and didn't flinch when he raised his voice. It made him itch under his skin. Made him feel seen in a way he didn't understand and didn't want. He looked at Chuck again, sizing him up like a problem he wasn't sure how to solve. The man hadn't moved an inch since telling him to stop talking. He just sat there still, as stone, not blinking too often, not giving anything away. Jax leaned back on his heels and gave a loud, forced laugh. He clapped once, then pointed at Chuck. This guy, he's like some Clint Eastwood wannabe, all brooding and no bite. Remy snorted from behind his phone, already filming again. He tilted the lens to catch Chuck's face, waiting for a reaction. There wasn't one. Just that same steady presence, like Chuck had already measured the room and found nothing in it to be afraid of. Marvin shifted slightly in his chair. One of the peppermints had rolled under his foot earlier, and as he tried to bend to reach it, his coat slipped from his lap and landed on the floor. He moved slowly, careful with his back, but his fingers missed the edge of the tin box in his pocket. It clattered and slid across the floor, stopping just shy of Jax's boot. Jax stepped forward and tapped the box with his toe. Not hard, just enough to move it a little further from Marvin's reach. Oops. Marvin didn't say a word. He just stared at the box. Chuck stood up. It wasn't fast or aggressive. It was controlled, deliberate, like gravity itself had allowed it. He stepped forward, picked up the box, brushed it off with his hand, and walked over to Marvin. Here you go, sir. That was all he said. Calm, steady, like returning a book to a shelf. He placed the box gently on Marvin's lap, then adjusted the man's coat so it wouldn't slide again. The room held its breath. Jax watched with something close to confusion. He didn't understand the move, but he felt it in his chest. That little shift in power. It burned worse than being yelled at. Remy turned his phone to Chuck again, zooming in as the older man stood by Marvin's chair. He chuckled, whispering just loud enough. What is this? Is it some kind of hero movie moment? Chuck turned his head, looked straight into the lens and pressed his palm gently over the top of the phone. The screen went black. He set the phone down on the shelf beside the combs. No force, no warning, just a done thing. Remy stared, mouth slightly open, unsure what to say. Jax's jaw tightened. He walked forward, stepping between Marvin and the door. Do you think you can just walk in here? What play Grandpa Cop? Chuck didn't answer. He just looked at Jax the way a man might look at a rusted nail in a fresh piece of wood. Not angry, just aware of the damage it might cause if left alone. Ray stood frozen behind the chair, hands still on the barber's cape. His eyes flicked between the two men. He didn't speak. Luca was leaning against the far wall, arms crossed. He hadn't moved since Chuck stood. He was watching now, but with something closer to caution than curiosity. Marvin tried to stand slow and steady, wanting to give Chuck room. But Jack shifted again, putting his foot just enough in front of Marvin's cane to make movement feel risky. Going somewhere, Chuck took one step forward. Not fast, not dramatic, just enough. Step aside. His voice wasn't louder than before, but now it filled the room. Not with volume, with weight. Jax blinked. His breath caught for half a second. His body stayed still, but something in him retreated. Chuck didn't need to raise his hands, didn't need to clench his fists. The shape of his stance said it all. His shoulders are square, his feet planted, his eyes locked, not on Jax's face, but somewhere deeper. Nobody moved. Not the boys, not Marvin, not even Ray. Chuck's voice came again, even softer this time. Let the man pass. Jack stepped back. He didn't know why exactly. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was something else, but he moved. Marvin nodded once, grateful, and stepped forward slowly, using his cane with care. The tension didn't leave the room. It just gathered differently, like a storm had shifted course but hadn't vanished. Remy reached for his phone and thought better of it. Luca kept his eyes low now. Chuck stepped back, returning to his seat like nothing had happened. Like he hadn't just turned the temperature of the room with 3 sentences and a look. Ray finally spoke. His voice was barely more than a whisper. "Marvin, are you ready for that trim?" Marvin gave a small nod, sat in the chair. Ray lifted the cape gently, hands still shaking but working. Outside, the sun had climbed higher, spilling gold across the sidewalk. Inside the shop was quiet again, but the quiet wasn't the same. It was loaded now. Like every wall and floorboard, I remembered what just happened. Jack sat down hard on the bench, tapping his fingers against his knee. He looked at Chuck, then away. There was nothing left to say. Not yet. Ray's clippers buzzed, but they didn't mask the silence that had fallen over the room. Every sound felt louder than it should. The scrape of the broom in the corner, the creak of the old bench when Luca shifted his weight, the soft click of Marvin's cane resting gently against the counter as he sat for his trim. Jax hadn't spoken since stepping aside, but his eyes never stopped moving. They twitched from Chuck to Marvin to Remy, as if trying to find a thread of control to pull. His pride sat bruised just beneath the surface, and the stillness in the room didn't soothe it. It rubbed against him like sandpaper. Remy leaned against the far wall, now silent, his phone untouched. Even he could feel it. Something had shifted. Chuck hadn't raised his voice, hadn't lifted a finger, but somehow the temperature had dropped and tightened like the pressure before a storm. Everyone knew it. Everyone except Jax. Jax tapped his boot twice, then stood. He walked over to the small table near Marvin's coat. The old man's silver cigarette case sat there, worn but polished, a relic from another time. Jax picked it up casually and held it in his hand like a toy. "Nice box. Probably worth something, huh?" Marvin didn't respond. Ray froze, mid-trim clippers hovering above Marvin's shoulder. Chuck didn't move. His eyes were steady, locked on the boy's hand. Jack smiled to no one, then let the case slip from his fingers. It hit the floor with a sharp metal crack, landing just past Marvin's feet. Oops, must have slipped. Marvin looked down slowly. He didn't say a word, just reached with effort, trying to bend in his seat, his back straining. Chuck stood again. Not fast, not loud, but like before it changed the air. "Leave it." Jax laughed, but the sound was thinner now, just helping the man stretch. Better for circulation. "Pick it up." Chuck's voice was calm, flat, but it landed hard. Jax blinked. What Chuck took one step forward. Not threatening, not angry, but filled with something weightier than either. "Pick it up, hand it back to him." For a moment the whole room waited. The radio still played that same country song, but now it sounded like background noise from a different world. Ray's hand trembled slightly. He reached under the counter and pressed a small button beneath the drawer, then rested his fingers on the wood as if nothing had happened. Jax bent not to help but to grab the case again. He picked it up and held it between 2 fingers. "You want it back, old man, or should I sell it to buy you some real pants?" Chuck's jaw flexed once. Jax tossed the case lightly back toward Marvin's lap. It hit the armrest and slid to the cushion. "There you go, delivered with care." Chuck didn't speak again. He stepped forward one more time. Close enough now that Jax had to tilt his chin to keep eye contact. The space between them felt too small. "That's the last thing you touch in this room that doesn't belong to you." There was no threat in the words, no heat, just a truth too solid to challenge. Jax held his smirk for half a breath longer, then turned away, muttering under it. But his hands were tight in his pockets, and his eyes didn't meet anyone else's. Remy shifted against the wall. Luca stared at the floor. Ray went back to his work clippers, shaking in his grip. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the front sign on its hook. The jingle was soft but hollow. Inside, something else began to settle. A pressure that everyone felt but no one named, like the room itself was holding its breath. Marvin brushed his fingers over the cigarette case and slipped it quietly back into his coat. His face gave nothing away, but he didn't look at Jax. He looked at Chuck, just for a second. Chuck nodded once, then sat back down. The tension didn't break, it thickened, like storm clouds gathering over dry land. Like the next sound might decide everything. Ray finished the trim with careful hands. The snip of scissors was the only sound for a while. Even the radio had given up. Nothing moved outside. Nothing felt safe. Remy looked at his phone but didn't lift it. Jack stayed standing now near the doorway, his shoulders stiff, his jaw set. He wasn't laughing anymore, but his silence was louder than any joke he'd told. Everyone knew what was coming. They just didn't know when. The metallic click of the door lock echoed louder than it should have. Jack spun the deadbolt with a grin that didn't reach his eyes and held his hands up like a street magician. Just keeping the vibe private. Can't have tourists walking in. Ray froze mid-step behind Marvin's chair. His hand tightened on the scissors. Marvin didn't look at Jax. He looked at Chuck. Chuck was already on his feet. He didn't speak, didn't rush. Just moved to the front, one hand brushing lightly against the doorframe as he checked the lock for himself. Confirmed. Solid. Not jammed. Chosen. That wasn't a joke. That was a test. Luca shifted by the wall, arms folded again, expression unreadable. Remy chuckled under his breath but didn't lift his phone. Even he could feel the weight that had just dropped into the room. Chuck's eyes passed over all three boys slow and measured, then stopped on Luca's forearm. His sleeves were pushed up slightly, just enough to reveal ink. Faint, not fresh, not careless either. A small triangle embedded in a gear surrounded by a broken chain. Chuck's gaze held there a moment longer than needed. That symbol wasn't graffiti, it was a mark. One he'd seen 15 years ago on the inside of a file folder in DC. The kind they stamped and then buried under 6 other layers of red tape. It didn't belong on a kid from Montana. He stepped back and sat again, but now his silence had shifted. His posture was still calm, but his eyes were sharper, focused. Not just in the room anymore, but on the larger map behind it. Luca noticed. Their eyes met and something flickered in the space between them. Not fear, not defiance, recognition. Jack spun on his heel and clapped again, forcing the sound into the quiet. "Come on, man. You're all acting like I pulled a weapon. Relax." Ray's voice came out tight. "That door's not yours to lock." Jack shrugged, then unlock it. Jax didn't move. Chuck didn't either. But his attention was on Luca now. Not with accusation, but something quieter. A weight behind the glance. He was working backward through time, through rumors, through names whispered in safe houses and back channels. A judge, a fund, a case that went nowhere because the right people didn't want it to. Luca broke eye contact first. Chuck leaned forward, hands laced loosely in his lap. He hadn't spoken since the door clicked. But now his thoughts were no longer about stopping a bully. Now he was reading a situation, calculating variables, asking himself questions he didn't want the answers to. What are these kids doing here? Why Eldridge? Why now? Luca had the look of someone who didn't belong in this mess but had been dragged into it by blood. Chuck had seen that look before. Sons of powerful men, left to wander too close to fire, not always by choice. Remy scratched his neck nerves, showing for the first time. He looked at Jax, then at the locked door, then at Chuck. Something had changed in him too. Jax didn't see it, or didn't want to. He moved closer to Marvin again now, just a few feet from the chair, testing the edge. But there was less fire in it now, more uncertainty. Like he'd walked too far into a dark cave and just realized the walls were moving. Chuck finally spoke. "Open the door." Jax hesitated, smiled like it was still a joke, but his hands didn't move. Chuck stood. This time his stance wasn't casual, it was full, balanced, like a man returning to form, like someone who'd carried this kind of moment before and knew what it required. "Open it. Now." The words weren't louder, but they landed with weight. Ray stepped behind the counter. His hand hovered near the drawer again, just in case. Luca shifted his stance. Remy's eyes darted toward the window, looking for lights, looking for help. Jax didn't reach for the lock. He stared at Chuck, at the set of his jaw, at the way his feet were planted. The whole room was holding its breath around him. Chuck didn't blink, didn't budge, but now beneath the silence there was a storm gathering. Not a physical one, a deeper one, like something old had been stirred awake, something that knew too much. Luca finally spoke. His voice was low, flat. "Open it, Jax." Jax turned to him. What Luca didn't repeat himself. Jax looked between them both. Chuck, then Luca, then Remy. Then he walked to the door and unlocked it. The sound was quiet, just a click, but it felt like thunder. Chuck exhaled once through his nose, not relief, just confirmation. Something was wrong here, something more than kids playing tough. He sat back down slowly, but his mind didn't. It had already moved 3 steps ahead. This wasn't about Marvin. It wasn't even about this room anymore. The lines were starting to show, and Chuck had seen this kind of web before, only this time it had found him. The door hung unlocked now, but no one moved to leave. The air had grown still again, but this time it was loaded with something too dense to name. Jack stood near Marvin, rocking slightly on his heels, his jaw clenched and unclenched as if trying to grind down something boiling inside him. Chuck hadn't sat back down. He remained standing, hands at his sides, not clenched, just ready. His breathing hadn't changed. Nothing about him had. But the room seemed to lean toward him now, as if gravity had shifted. Jax pointed at Marvin's cane and then looked at Chuck. "So what now, Grandpa? You gonna make me sit? You gonna make me respect him?" Chuck took a slow step forward, just enough to put himself between Marvin and the boy. "You've done enough." His voice was calm. That same low, even tone. The kind that didn't rise to meet a challenge because it never had to. Jax laughed once. The sound was dry, forced. Then he moved, fast. His shoulder dropped, his right arm sweeping up and wide. It wasn't clean. It wasn't practiced. It was rage in motion, a swing born of frustration more than intent. But it moved fast enough to catch most men off guard. Chuck didn't flinch. He stepped inside. The arc caught the wrist with one hand, the elbow with the other, and turned. There was no sound but the shuffle of feet on tile and the soft thump of fabric hitting the floor. Jax was on his back, one knee pinned under Chuck's, his arm held in a firm, unmoving hold. Not pain, not damaged, just control. Jax blinked, stunned. His other hand reached for the floor, trying to push himself up. Don't. Chuck didn't shout. He didn't tighten the hold. He just looked down and said it once. Don't. Jax froze. Remy moved next, a half step forward, shoulder hunched, phone forgotten on the bench. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. Then his foot shifted and he lunged. It was messy, more instinct than plan. Chuck rose smoothly, releasing Jax with one fluid motion, and turned. He didn't strike. He didn't block. He stepped into Remy's path, one palm lifted gently to the boy's chest. The force stopped Remy cold. The momentum died right there. Then Chuck looked him in the eye. Just one look. Remy's breath caught. His arm stayed up, but he didn't move again. Chuck's voice dropped even lower. You're not built for this. Remy's face flushed, not from shame, but something closer to reality settling in. He backed away, hands still raised, head nodding once, almost involuntarily. Luca had never moved. He had stayed still, pressed near the wall, eyes locked on Chuck the entire time. He didn't speak. He didn't blink. But when Chuck turned his head toward him, Luca looked down, not in fear, in understanding. The whole thing had lasted less than 10 seconds. No punches, no yelling, no blood. But every person in that room now understood who Chuck was. Not because he hurt anyone, because he hadn't needed to. Ray stood behind the barber chair, frozen with his scissors still in hand. Marvin hadn't moved. His cane rested lightly against the counter again, his fingers still curled around the armrest. But his eyes were wide, not with fear, with awe. Jax lay on the floor, breathing hard. His pride was bruised deeper than his back, but he didn't reach for anything again. His hands stayed flat on the tile. His voice didn't come. Chuck turned away from him and checked on Marvin. Just a quick glance. You all right? Marvin nodded once, slow and firm. Chuck stepped back, gave space, and then quietly walked over to the bench. He picked up Remy's phone and placed it beside the kid, careful, like he was setting down something fragile. Then came the sound. Sirens. Distant at first, then growing clearer. Still a few blocks off, but close enough to cut through the silence. Jack sat up. His face sagged. Not in pain. In defeat. Remy leaned against the wall, breathing, shallow eyes wide. Luca stepped toward Chuck. His voice was barely above a whisper. You recognized it, didn't you? Chuck didn't answer, but he looked at him long enough that Luca knew the truth. Ray finally exhaled, a sharp, shaky breath that filled the whole room with release. Outside, the wind stirred the leaves along the sidewalk. Inside, the air was different now, like something had broken and settled at once. Chuck didn't look proud, didn't look angry. He looked like a man who had carried this too many times before. He sat down again, folded his hands, and waited. The squad car rolled to a stop just as the last siren faded. Sheriff Darlene Boone stepped out calm as the sky before a summer storm. She didn't walk fast. She didn't reach for her weapon. She didn't have to. Boone was in her late 50s, solid built, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a voice that never rose unless she meant it. Her hair was pulled back tight beneath her Stetson, and the silver on her badge caught the morning light. She paused at the door to Ray's barbershop, hand resting gently on the handle, taking in the stillness beyond the glass. She stepped inside. The bell gave a weak jingle. Every head turned. Jax was still on the floor, propped against the bench. His shirt was rumpled, his breath shallow. Remy stood by the far wall, arms crossed, trying to disappear. Luca sat alone on the corner stool, elbows on his knees, head low. Marvin stayed in the chair, coat folded neatly across his lap, eyes steady. And Chuck. Chuck was standing near the window, hands relaxed, shoulders easy, like nothing about this moment surprised him. Boone's eyes found him at once. She didn't say his name, but she gave a nod, and he returned it. Ray cleared his throat, but said nothing. Boone walked the room in one slow glance, reading the story and the posture in silence. Does somebody want to explain? Marvin was the first to speak. He shifted forward slightly in his chair. Nothing got too bad, Darlene. Just kids being foolish. No harm done. Boone gave him a look, not unkind, but knowing. The kind of look that saw through a man's words and checked for bruises underneath. She turned to Ray. You pressed the button. Ray nodded, once. His eyes didn't meet hers. She looked back at Chuck. He didn't move, didn't offer a version of events. Boone stepped toward Jax. The boy didn't lift his head. She crouched down beside him, not close just enough to see his face better. You hurt. Jax shook his head. His eyes flicked up at Chuck, then back down. She stood again, turned to Luca. You all come into town together. Luca nodded barely. Boone studied him for a long second. Then her eyes dropped to his arm. The sleeve had fallen just enough again. She saw the edge of the triangle and the gear. She looked at Chuck. He nodded, slow and subtle. Boone exhaled through her nose and turned to Ray. You all right? Ray gave a small nod, still shaky. She walked to Marvin and laid a gentle hand on his shoulder. You sure you're okay? Marvin gave a tired smile. I've been through worse. This wasn't anything I couldn't handle. Boone straightened, then looked again at Chuck. Her voice dropped just enough to make the room feel smaller. "Step outside with me." Chuck gave a brief nod and followed her to the door. The others stayed quiet as the bell rang again. Out on the sidewalk, the breeze had picked up. The sky had gone pale blue and the street was empty but for the patrol car. Boone turned to face him, hands on her belt. "It's been a while." Chuck didn't smile. "Yeah." She squinted slightly. "I figured you'd be riding solo up in Idaho or somewhere colder. Didn't want the cold, wanted quiet." Boone tilted her head toward the shop. "Didn't quite get it, not today." They stood there a moment, not speaking. Then she motioned slightly toward the window. "That boy, the one on the stool. Luca. You recognize the ink?" Chuck nodded. "I've seen it before. 15 years ago. Back east. An operation that didn't make headlines." Boone's face tightened. "You sure?" He looked at her. "You know I don't guess." She didn't answer right away. Her eyes drifted back to the barber shop, watching the shapes move behind the glass. He is the threat. No, not him. The others. Their noise. But noise is tied to something. Boone crossed her arms. Her voice dropped again. "You think this is just a coincidence?" Chuck looked out at the empty street. "No, I think someone sent them. Or let them go. And I think the mark on that kid's arm means we're staring at something we can't file under small-town trouble." Boone breathed out slowly. Her gaze shifted from Chuck to the quiet hills beyond. "I didn't think you came here to fight." "I didn't." "Then what made you walk into Ray's today?" Chuck looked back at the shop, at Marvin through the window, sitting steady like a mountain. "He was there. I thought maybe that was enough reason." Boone nodded once, a quiet acceptance. Then she stepped aside and pulled a small notepad from her back pocket. "You stay close. I'll talk to the boys. But I want to know more about that symbol. And if it's what I think it is, this isn't just yours anymore." Chuck looked her in the eye. "It never was just mine." Boone didn't smile, but something in her face said trust. Said she remembered the man she knew in uniform, still saw him now. She opened the door. The bell rang again, and Eldridge, for the first time that morning, began to feel like it might settle for now. The sidewalk outside Ray's barbershop was quiet now. Only the low hum of wind brushing against the windows and the faint ticking of a cooling engine filled the silence. Chuck stood with his arms loosely crossed, looking out at the empty road. Boone leaned against the side of her patrol car, not speaking yet. She gave him time. "What exactly did you see?" Chuck didn't turn. His voice came steady low. "Tattoo, left arm, triangle inside a gear chain broken across the base." Boone narrowed her eyes. "That symbol showed up during a black file case I got pulled into. Berlin 97. Quiet operation. Quiet shutdown." Boone waited. A task force was tracking a series of backdoor military transactions. Weapons, logistics rerouted. Most of it is buried in NGO front work. The symbol showed up on documents tied to internal approvals that shouldn't have existed. He paused. One name floated above the rest. Federal judge. Had an advisory connection to overseas civilian security funding. Nothing direct, just enough to look clean. Boone shifted slightly. Luca's father, Chuck, nodded. "I saw the name back then. Twice. Got redacted both times. My team got pulled. The case was marked unprovable. Lost 2 years of work. We buried it. The world moved on." Boone let out a slow breath. "And now the judge's son is here, in my town, sitting in Ray's barbershop like a lost kid looking for a fight." Chuck looked over at her. "Not just a fight, a stage, like someone wants a message delivered, or wants to see who steps forward when things go sideways. You think the boy knows?" Chuck shook his head. "No, he's not that deep in. But someone put him here, maybe to burn a bridge, maybe to light one. I don't know yet." Boone crossed her arms, mirroring his stance. "You want to pursue this?" Chuck didn't answer right away. "I came here for peace, wanted to be somewhere quiet, somewhere honest. Marvin's got a steady heart. I thought maybe standing near that would be enough. But you stepped in. Had to. Not for the badge, not for the files. Just because that old man deserved dignity, sometimes you stand not because of who you are, but because of who's watching." Boone nodded slowly. "You'd testify if this reopened?" Chuck's answer was quiet. "No, not again." Boone didn't press. He continued. "But I'll give you the names, the units, the markers, enough to find the rest if you dig." Boone looked at him for a long moment. "You were always the kind who carried things too far on your own." Chuck gave a faint smile. "That's why I left. There's no medal for being the last one standing when the war's already moved on." The breeze picked up. A loose scrap of newspaper fluttered down the sidewalk. Boone didn't move to catch it. She glanced back at the barber shop. "What about the boys?" Chuck kept his eyes ahead. "Luca needs to know where he came from, but he's got a choice. Remy will follow the wind if it blows hard enough. Jax, that one's cracked from something deeper. You'll have to make that call." Boone gave a tight nod. "You leaving town eventually?" "Soon." Chuck looked up at the sky. "Depends on what follows me next." They stood there for a long while. No more words came. They didn't need to. The weight of old ghosts hung between them, not heavy, just present. Boone stepped back toward her car and pulled out her notepad. Write what you remember. Doesn't have to be formal, just enough to start a path. Chuck reached into his coat and pulled a folded page from a pocket that had looked untouched for years. Already wrote it. Thought I'd never hand it to anyone. Boone took it without a word, tucked it into her front pocket like something sacred. Chuck gave her a final nod. Then I turned back toward the bench outside the shop and sat, quiet, still, watching the street as if it might speak to him. Boone stood a few feet from the bench where Chuck sat. She hadn't gone far. The slip of paper he'd given her felt heavy in her jacket even though it barely weighed an ounce. She looked at him, that same quiet steadiness in her face, but something behind it had shifted. You know I need more than this. Chuck didn't look up. He was watching the street again like it carried answers if you stared long enough. You have enough to start. That's not what I mean. I want you on this, even if unofficially. I could use a man like you in the room. Someone who's seen what most people look away from. Chuck let out a slow breath. Not sharp, just tired. I'm not your guy. Boone stepped closer. Not to press him, but to be heard better. You were once. You still are. Don't pretend this thing isn't waking something up in you. He looked at her then. His eyes weren't hard, just worn. It's not about waking anything up. I didn't come here to fight ghosts. I came for quiet. I came for something small and decent, and I found it, even if just for a little while. Boone nodded, but she didn't step back. That quiet doesn't stay unless people like you make noise when it counts. Chuck gave a faint smile. I already did. Today. You saw it. She looked at the ground, then back at him. So that's it. He nodded once. That's it. I didn't step in because I'm chasing justice. I stepped in because Marvin deserved better. The boys, they didn't need a file. They needed someone to draw a line they could feel. Now they felt it. Boone's jaw tightened. Not from frustration, from understanding. You think that's enough? It's not enough. It's about timing. You step in when the lesson matters. Then you let folks make their own choices. Sometimes that's the best you can do. Most times it's the only thing that sticks. Boone took a long look toward the barber shop. The window caught the sunlight just right. Inside she could see Marvin still sitting talking softly with Ray. Luca hadn't moved from the bench. The others had gone quiet. She turned back to Chuck. So you're walking away? No, I'm just stepping aside. That's different. This isn't my road to finish. It's yours now. Boone reached out her hand, not with ceremony, just a simple offer, a closing. He took it, shook once firm and steady. She said nothing else, just nodded, turned and walked to her cruiser. Chuck watched her go. The gravel crunched beneath her boots. The door shut. The engine turned. She didn't look back. When she pulled away, Chuck stood, stretched his back and turned toward the barber shop. The sun was higher now. The town hadn't changed, but something in it had, and for now, that was enough. The bell above Ray's door gave a soft jingle as Boone stepped inside. She held the door open longer than usual, waiting for the three boys to follow. No cuffs, no chains, just gravity in their steps. Jax walked in first, shoulders, tight eyes darting like he was still deciding whether this counted as punishment or mercy. Remy shuffled in behind him, his hands shoved deep in his hoodie, head low. Luca came last, steady and silent, gaze already fixed on the back wall like he was bracing for something heavier than words. Ray looked up from the counter. He'd been sweeping the same corner for 5 minutes. Marvin sat in the usual chair by the window cane, resting beside him, a paperback unopened in his lap. Neither of them stood, but both of them watched. Boone stepped aside and let the boys find their own path forward. She didn't say a word, just closed the door and leaned against it, arms crossed. It was Jax who broke the silence first, not because he was ready, but because the stillness was worse than any courtroom. All right, so, I guess we're here to say stuff. Ray raised an eyebrow, but Marvin gave no reaction, just waited. Jack scratched at the back of his neck, then looked at Marvin. I messed up. I mean, we did. But it started with me. I was being a jerk. More than a jerk. He swallowed, hard eyes blinking a little too fast. I thought you were just some old guy who wouldn't push back that it didn't matter, that I didn't matter. But I saw what happened after, and I was wrong. His voice cracked just slightly. He looked down, then back up. I'm sorry for real. I'm sorry. The words sat there unpolished, raw. They weren't eloquent, but they were real. Remy didn't step forward, just stayed a step behind Jax and cleared his throat. Yeah, same. I shouldn't have laughed. I shouldn't have filmed anything. I wasn't thinking about who I was hurting. Just thought it was funny. I don't know why. His voice got quieter. It wasn't. Marvin nodded slowly, just once. Then Luca stepped forward. His voice didn't shake, it didn't rush, it carried something different. I've spent a lot of time pretending I wasn't part of where I came from. My father made choices I never understood. and I tried to make myself small enough not to be seen with his name on me. He looked directly at Marvin now. But that's still not an excuse. I walked in here that day knowing better. I didn't stop them, and maybe part of me didn't want to because I thought if I said nothing I couldn't be held responsible. I know now that's not true. He stepped back, voice still calm. I'm sorry. To you, to Ray, to everyone who had to feel smaller because we felt louder. Ray finally moved. He leaned the broom against the wall and walked up beside Marvin. His hands were still, his voice softer than usual. Takes guts to come back and face what you broke, more than most folks manage. He looked at all three of them. Don't waste the next shot. They don't come around twice. Marvin nodded again, this time with more weight. He looked at Jax. You reminded me how hard it is for young men to admit they're not right. So if today's the first time you ever did that, it's a good start. He looked at Remy. And laughter's cheap when you don't have to carry the cost. Just remember, the people you laugh at are often the ones who've seen more than you ever will. Then he looked at Luca. And you've got the most dangerous thing of all, a quiet voice and a long shadow. Be careful who you let stand in it. Boone stepped forward then. This town doesn't run on punishment. It runs on memory. People remember when you mess up. They also remember when you show up to make it right. She motioned toward the window. Marvin volunteers at the senior center. Needs a little help with supply runs, sorting, some cleanup. Starts tomorrow. You'll be there, all three of you. Jax looked like he might argue. Then he looked at Marvin again and nodded. Boone gave one last glance at the room, then opened the door. The wind outside had shifted, lighter, less sharp. One by one the boys walked out, and the barber shop for the first time in a week felt like it could breathe again. The shop had settled into its usual hush. Ray swept quietly near the back while Marvin sat in his chair, hands resting on his knees. The boys were gone, Boone too. Outside the wind had slowed. The bell above the door didn't move. Ray walked over with a small white envelope in his hand. Chuck came by before sunup. Didn't say much. Just asked you to give me this when things feel still again. Marvin took the envelope without speaking. He turned it over once, then again. No name on the front. Just the clean, steady crease of a man who folded things with care. He opened it slowly. The paper was thick, plain, handwritten. The pen moved firmly and evenly. No hesitation in the strokes. He began to read. Marvin, you don't know the whole reason I was in that barber shop last week. Not really. You might think it was luck, or that I just stepped in because I could. But there's more to it than that. In 1978, I was stationed briefly in Tokyo, still green around the edges. One night off base, I was walking through a market district. Narrow streets, neon. Rain is just starting to fall. There was a small vendor selling roasted chestnuts. He was older, bent slightly at the spine. He wore a clean apron and a proud expression. Two drunk expats started mocking him, loud, stupid. One of them knocked over his cart. Chestnuts rolled across the sidewalk. They laughed. He didn't. I watched from across the street, hands in my pockets. I saw it all, and I did nothing. No one else stepped in either. Maybe they were tired. Maybe they thought it wasn't their place. Maybe they were like me, thinking the shame would pass. But it didn't. Not for me. That man picked up each chestnut by hand in the rain while they walked away. I never forgot it. Not the smell, not the look on his face, and not my silence. I've done a lot of things since then. Some good, some heavy. But that moment, it stayed with me because it showed me what kind of man I could have been and chose not to be. When I walked into Ray's shop that day and saw you sitting there head held high while three boys tested your dignity, I saw him again. That old man in Tokyo. And I knew this time I wasn't going to stay quiet. Maybe that moment in 78 couldn't be undone, but this one could be stood up to. And sometimes, Marvin, that's the best we get. The right moment to answer an old wrong. You didn't ask for help. You didn't need saving. You held your own like a man who's carried more than he ever dropped. But I needed to stand beside you. Not for justice, for peace, for something I owed myself. I'll be moving on soon. Don't know where to go next. Doesn't really matter, but I wanted you to know this wasn't just about a barbershop. It was about memory and about getting something right while there's still time. Thank you for letting me borrow a moment of yours to settle a moment of mine. Be well. Chuck Marvin sat still for a long time after the letter ended. His fingers stayed curled around the edges, the fold lines pressed just barely from where the ink still dried. Ray didn't ask what it said. He didn't need to. Marvin folded the letter slowly, one crease at a time. Then he slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat. He looked out the window. The street was still empty, but somehow it didn't feel quiet anymore. The sun had only begun to stretch across the rooftops when Marvin stepped out of his house. His boots met the soft gravel with that steady, even rhythm he carried through everything. One hand held his cane. The other was a small canvas sack with gloves, hand tools, and a thermos of tea. It was Saturday. Annie had somewhere to be. The senior center garden sat behind the old brick building, half tucked behind a row of sugar maples. A few raised beds were already showing signs of spring coming early. Marvin walked the path slowly but sure boots brushing aside loose leaves. When he rounded the last corner, he saw them. Jax, Remy, Luca. They were standing near the shed, not talking. Jax kept shifting from foot to foot. Remy had his hands jammed deep in his jacket. Luca leaned back against the wood frame, arms folded, watching the morning light break through the trees. They'd come. That much mattered. Marvin didn't say much. He nodded once and walked to the bench beside the first raised bed. He set the bag down, unsnapped it, and handed out gloves without ceremony. Here, these'll do. The boys took them wordlessly. Jax glanced at Remy like he was waiting for some kind of cue. Luca didn't move until Marvin pointed gently at the far plot. That one needs to be turned. They began. Clumsy at first, tools scraping at the dirt in fits and starts. Marvin gave quiet instructions. No lectures, no judgment, just where to dig, where to step, how to clear weeds without disturbing the roots. Time passed that way. No one looked at their phones. No one asked when it would end. Ray showed up around 9 with a small tray of coffees. He didn't bring extra cups, just handed them out as if he knew who needed which. Black for Marvin, cream and sugar for the rest. He stayed a few minutes, made a quiet joke about someone's crooked row of carrots. Jack smiled just barely. Then Ray left. No handshakes, no goodbye, just a nod and his slow walk back toward town. Sometime later, Sierra appeared. She wasn't holding her usual gear. No mic, no wide lens, just a small disposable camera in one hand and a basket of apples in the other. She offered the fruit without a word, then sat on the edge of the stone wall near the fence. She watched, but didn't shoot. Not once. Marvin noticed that. He appreciated it. The boys kept working. They didn't move fast. They didn't complain. But they moved together, and that was new. Remy helped Jax with the compost bin. Luca stayed with the soil, digging the lines straight, now smooth and even. Marvin watched from the shade, one hand on his cane, the other wrapped around the warm metal of his thermos. He wasn't thinking grand thoughts, wasn't replaying speeches or lessons. He was just watching like someone who'd seen the worst parts of men and knew what a quiet morning could mean when folk showed up anyway. A breeze passed through the garden. It rustled the branches above and stirred the loose soil in the beds. No one spoke. Then low and distant came the sound, a soft rumble, steady, rolling up from the main road, the motorcycle. It wasn't fast, it wasn't loud, just present enough to be felt more than heard. Marvin turned his head slow and calm toward the fence that faced the street. He caught only a glimpse. The bike didn't slow, didn't turn in. It passed through the edge of the morning like a page turning quietly. But Marvin saw the shape of it, the way it moved, the quiet rhythm of the engine not racing, just carrying. He watched until the sound faded down the road. Then he smiled, not wide, not for anyone to notice, just enough, because he knew. He looked back at the boys. They were still working, and for the first time they looked like they might want to. The porch creaked gently under Marvin's weight as he settled into the old wooden chair. It was the kind of chair that remembered things, summers, storms, laughter, loss. It didn't rock anymore, but it didn't need to. It just held him steady. He held a glass of sweet tea in one hand, the rim sweating against his fingers. The sun hadn't reached its peak yet. The light was warm, not sharp. A breeze moved through the yard, brushing the tall grass at the edges where he hadn't bothered to mow. Some things were better left wild. His granddaughter sat in the grass near the steps. She wasn't saying much, just humming as she stacked stones. Careful, focused. Marvin smiled at that. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out the folded paper. Edges are worn now. Creases softened from being opened more than once. Chuck's letter. The one left without fanfare, the one read in silence. He opened it again. Not for answers, just for the rhythm of the words. Thank you for letting me borrow a moment of yours to settle a moment of mine. Marvin read that line again. He didn't rush past it, let it sink. He thought about all the moments people asked to borrow. Most didn't return them. Most never said why they needed it in the first place, but this one was different. Chuck hadn't come to impress or redeem, he'd just come to do something right. That was rare. Marvin looked out past the porch, eyes resting on the road that curved down toward town. It was empty now. Just gravel and grass and the occasional rabbit darting across like it had somewhere important to be. He thought about dignity, not the kind that comes from medals or titles, the kind that grows slowly like old trees, the kind you don't notice until someone tries to take it. There had been a moment back in that barber shop when he'd felt something close to small, not fear, not shame, just that cold sense of being disregarded. He'd sat still, let the noise wash over. That used to be enough, but not that day, because someone had stepped in, not with speeches, not with fury, just with presence. Marvin took another sip of tea. The glass clinked gently as he set it on the armrest. He thought about his wife, about how she used to sit on the porch with him when the weather was kind. She'd hum under her breath, same as the girl in the yard now. There was comfort in that sound, familiar, soft without being fragile. He closed his eyes for a moment, not asleep, just resting. The breeze picked up, lifting the corner of the letter in his lap. He placed a hand over it. This wasn't a story for headlines. It wasn't something folks would talk about much next week, but something had shifted. A thread pulled, a knot loosened. The boys were learning, slowly, but they were showing up. That meant something. He thought about Chuck, riding alone, leaving quietly. Some men arrive loudly, wanting to be noticed. Others just come when they're needed and leave before the dust settles. Chuck had always seemed like that kind of person. Steady, carried too much, spoke too little. Marvin respected that. He glanced down at his granddaughter. She was holding 2 small stones up to the sun, seeing which one caught the light better. The look on her face reminded him that everything worth saving took patience. He folded the letter again gently this time and slipped it back into his pocket. He didn't need to frame it, didn't need to read it out loud to anyone. The words were already planted. Sometimes peace didn't come all at once. It just showed up one quiet morning when the air was soft and your hands weren't trembling. He leaned back in the chair, didn't say a word. He didn't have to. Jack still didn't like waking up early. The shop opened at 7 and the old man who ran it didn't care much for excuses. But Jack showed up anyway. Grease under his nails, dust on his boots. Some mornings he muttered under his breath. Other mornings he didn't say a word. But he was there. The mechanic Walt had known Marvin for decades. They'd shared beers and silence in equal measure. When Boone asked if he'd take a chance on a kid with something to prove, Walt didn't blink. He handed Jax a wrench and told him not to lose it. That was the beginning. Jax didn't always get it right. He stripped bolts and snapped belts. Once I left a rag inside a carburetor. Walt didn't yell. He just pointed and waited. Jax fixed his own mistakes. That mattered more than getting it right the first time. Most days he still wore that edge. The old cockiness hadn't vanished, but it had softened. Jax had learned the difference between attention and respect. One faded quickly, the other took longer to earn, but it stayed. Down the street, Remy's cafe didn't have much space. 4 tables, 2 stools, a shelf of mismatched mugs he'd bought second-hand. The coffee wasn't fancy, but it was strong. He made it himself every morning with hands that no longer shook when he poured. The sign on the door was simple: free coffee for veterans. Marvin had seen it once and nodded, saying nothing. That was enough. Remy didn't talk much about that day in the barber shop, but he kept a photo behind the counter. Just a shot of the town square on a quiet afternoon. No faces, just place. When someone asked, he'd say it reminded him of where he'd started turning the page. He still cracked jokes, still had that nervous energy when crowds got too loud. But when an old man came in and asked for help with the lid on his thermos, Remy didn't blink. He helped, every time. And then there was Luca. He could have disappeared, could have gone back to whatever silence he'd grown up inside. But instead he showed up at the nursing home on the edge of town with a stack of paperbacks and a quiet offer. They needed help setting up audiobooks, tablets, simple things. Luca stayed, week after week. His voice was calm and clear. He read aloud to folks who couldn't hold the pages anymore, taught one man how to video call his son for the first time in years. He never spoke about his father. He never mentioned the tattoo. But he asked questions. He listened. When a woman named Ruth cried halfway through a poem, he didn't rush to fix it. He just sat with her, holding the moment until it passed. Each of the boys still carried what they'd been. Jack still flinched when he felt disrespected. Remy still covered nerves with too many words. Luca still watched the room before entering it. But now their weight wasn't just about what they'd done. It was about what they were doing, bit by bit, task by task. Chuck hadn't lectured them. He hadn't punished them. He'd simply shown up, calm, certain, present. And that had planted something. Now in their own ways they were watering it. No one called it redemption. No one handed them medals or wrote their stories down. But they were changing, slowly, honestly, one quiet morning at a time. Some stories don't begin with fireworks. They start quietly. A cup of tea, a walk to the barber shop, a man sitting where he always sits doing what he always does simply because it's right. Marvin Dubois didn't ask to be noticed. He didn't need a spotlight. He just needed the world to keep its dignity long enough for him to hold on to his. And then a few boys walked in and almost took it from him. They didn't mean to shatter anything, not at first. They were just loud, careless, maybe a little angry at the world without knowing why. But that's how damage often starts, not with evil. People forget how much weight their words can carry. What changed that day wasn't the volume of their cruelty. It was the silence that followed. Because into that silence walked a man who had learned long ago that some wrongs only take a moment to begin, and only a moment to stop. Chuck Norris didn't fight for applause. He didn't fight at all, not really. He just stood, steady, still, watching. And when the moment came, he didn't raise his voice. He just held the line between what should be allowed and what should never be. And in doing so, he reminded everyone in that room who they were supposed to be. The town didn't change overnight. There were no front-page headlines. But something shifted, a seed maybe, or a pause, long enough for a few boys to find a different path, long enough for an old man to feel seen. Marvin kept his chair by the window. He still visited Ray every Wednesday, still walked slowly with purpose. But now when he passed the cafe, the mechanic's shop, or the nursing home library, he saw those boys again, not as who they were, but as to who they were becoming. That mattered, because change doesn't always announce itself. It shows up in coffee poured without charge. The tools are wiped down at the end of the day. In books, it is read aloud to someone who can't see the page anymore. Chuck never stayed long. That's not the kind of man he was. He came through town with the wind just long enough to shift the dust, clear the air, and move on. No interviews, no promises, just presence. And somewhere beyond the hills outside Eldridge, he rides still. No fanfare, no destination. Just the quiet rhythm of tires on pavement, the hum of a motor tuned not for speed, but for distance. His eyes were on the horizon, his past folded neatly in the saddlebag. Peace riding in the wind behind him. He leaves no trail. Only impact, and in the soft echoes of his visit something lingers, a sense that the old code still breathes, not written down, not shouted, but carried one step at a time by those willing to hold the line, even when no one's watching. Especially then. Sometimes the most powerful thing a man can do is simply stand when standing is the hardest, and Chuck did, for nothing more than what was right.